welcoming everyone to the our session on India, the world's pharmacy expands its reach in global health. You've already had the privilege of listening to the Foreign Secretary. It is now my privilege to introduce to you Dr. Renu Swaroop, the Secretary of the Department of Biotechnology, Ministry of Science and Technology, and also the Chairperson of BIRAC. Now, Dr. Swaroop is the Secretary, Department of Biotechnology. She's served in this department for over 30 years. She also holds the position of Chairperson, Biotechnology Industry Research Assistant Council, or the BIRAC, a public sector company incorporated by the government to nurture and promote innovation research in the biotech enterprise with a special focus on startups and small and medium enterprises. Dr. Swaroop is a PhD in genetics and plant breeding. She completed her postdoctoral at the John Innes Centre, Norwich, UK, under the Commonwealth Scholarship, and returned to India to take up the assignment of a science manager in the Department of Biotechnology in 1989. As Secretary to the Government of India, Department of Biotech, she leads a network of 16 autonomous research institutes, 2 public sector undertakings, and an R&D network of more than 5,000 projects across more than 100 research institutes, universities, and laboratories. In the recent pandemic, she has led the COVID vaccine and diagnostic mission, and I'm sure she has spent more sleepless nights than many of us. The public sector BIRAC, for which she is the founding managing director, now chairperson, has supported nearly 3,000 startups and 50 incubators. And that perhaps is the most opportune moment to go across to her and ask her to deliver her special address, after which we'll have a short fireside chat with Hari Menon. It's over to you, Dr. Swaroop.
Thank you very much. Am I audible now?
Yes, a little louder, please.
A little louder. Okay. Is that okay now?
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity to be here with all of you and to discuss about the world's pharmacy and how we are really looking at India playing a very important and central role in this. I think where we are positioned today, and that is in the pandemic that we've had over the last year, has clearly brought the science and technology to the forefront. In fact, it has brought it to the center stage. And the role that India has played in being able to contribute to this has been obviously something that's been watched very carefully. And we in India, and also how we've contributed to India and the world, we are very proud of this contribution that our scientists and researchers have made. So while in fact, I have to compliment the team for having brought out this white paper, this document which talks about India, the world pharmacy, and how it expands its reach in global health. It talks about all the areas of diagnostics and therapeutics and vaccines. And if you see where India, how we tackled this COVID, it was very early on. And in fact, if you look at how our strategy was prepared for the response to this pandemic, it started in January 2020 itself. And then the discussions began on how we could respond to it. The first blueprint of the WHO, which was in February when they had the discussion, the India strategic plan on the research, science and technology interventions which would come in for the pandemic was presented there. Since then, if you go on to see, we have very clearly been able to bring out our strengths and in terms of the diagnostics, and our diagnostics is a true success story that we are very proud of. In less than 60 days, we achieved complete 100% self-reliance when we were at that point of time rapidly scaling up our diagnostic tests. In fact, when we started in March, we had total dependency on these imports that we were bringing in. And that is when we realized that as the numbers go up, there were supply chain disruptions. It was important that the country builds its own capacities. And it's with those capacities that we worked, we sort of ignited the challenge amongst our startups, researchers, and innovators, and they responded to it. Another big challenge that came to us at that point of time was, while the chips can be produced, the technologies are ready, where are the components going to come from? Because we had huge dependencies on the components as well. And then we put together this consortium of uh, various startups, small companies, manufacturers, who looked at bringing in the required reagents and various components for the diagnostics to overcome this supply chain issue that we had. And in less than 3 months, we had NBRIC, which is our National Biotech Resource Indigenization Consortium, which today has nearly about 200 manufacturers in it, all responding to this demand aggregation that we put in, bringing in a supply chain that helped us to move forward. And today, before you, we not only have diagnostics which are being used within the country, but we have diagnostics which we are now looking at exporting. In fact, that's really where our strength comes in from, and we are happy to see how in the diagnostics itself, we've also been able to respond to the global needs. The therapeutics, of course, as whole our pharma industry has been responding to the therapeutic requirements, our story of the pharma in terms of COVID, whether it's the hydroxychloroquine and others, it's something which we are all, again, very, very proud of. Coming specifically to the vaccines, and I'm sure Mr. Shingla in the address before me, when he's spoken about it, has given you an excellent detailed talk about how our vaccine Maitri, or the vaccine friendship and diplomacy program, has moved in terms of the Indian vaccine being made available globally. That is definitely one of our contributions that we are very proud of. And here again, it's important to mention that when we did have this discussion very early on about the ACT Accelerator, about our partnership with the COVAX, we had at that point of time said that we will have our manufacturing capacities as the pledge that we make for this particular vaccine, the global supplies or demands of vaccine. Our Honorable Prime Minister had, way back in June in the Vaccine Summit, made this commitment that India would have vaccines not just for India but for the world. We again in the UN General Assembly meet again, he did mention this talk, and this is really what we worked for. We are so proud that today 2 vaccines which have received emergency use authorization. India is the largest supplier to the COVAX as of now in terms of the numbers of vaccines which are being distributed. Also the vaccines which are going through grants to many of our neighboring countries as we move on. It's important to just step back for a moment and see that what is it that we are really talking about? How are we looking at this level of confidence that as we move forward, we're going to have vaccines which are going to be for India and the world? It's because we have a very robust pipeline of vaccines which are under development. India has been known to be the vaccine manufacturer, but the vaccine developer and manufacturer is what we are now really taking forward in terms of our COVID vaccine program that we are taking ahead. 2 vaccines, emergency use authorization, another 5 or 6 vaccines which are now in the human trials, another 3 or 4 vaccines which are in the late stages of preclinical trials. In fact, when we began somewhere towards the middle of last year in 2020, May and June, there were about 30 candidates that we were supporting across public and private sector. Today, as I've said, there's about 15 candidates which are in different stages of development, which we feel confident in the next couple of weeks, at least these 6 vaccines would be rolling out, and then we would have many others which come in. A variety of platforms, from the mRNA vaccine, which we are developing, Genova is developing, to the DNA vaccine, which Cyrus Cadila is doing, to the RBD protein vaccine, which BioE is working on. Bharat Biotech, in addition to their Covaxin, which is made available, is now looking at the nasal vaccine. So a number of such. We've also partnered with the Russian Sputnik vaccine. And this is really the strength that we're moving ahead. The government took a conscious decision that there is going to be complete facilitation to help accelerate the pace of this development. under the Atmanirbhar Bharat 3.0 package, we had a special Indian indigenous vaccine development mission that we launched, the Mission COVID Suraksha, a roughly $200 to $250 million mission, which is looking at COVID Suraksha and also the support that we give to existing missions of the biopharma mission, our partnership with STEPI under the INSTEPI. What have we done? We've created a very robust ecosystem. From the immunoassay lab to the animal challenge studies to more than 54 clinical trial sites in the country. That's really the strength that we're working forward with. We're also looking to see how we can try and take forward the whole area of developing these vaccines further beyond COVID as well. And I think that's the strength that we're working on. We're also trying to see how we handle the variants. And for this, we've developed immunoassays. These immunoassays that we've developed are those that we are trying to see on these variants to see how we could look at developing or testing these variants across these immunoassays. I think what is important is how are we going to make sure that these vaccines that we have respond to these variants? And we have been able to do that as well. We've got these immunoassays ready and we hope we'll be able to test all of them. So moving forward, I think our strength is how are we going to position these vaccines, not just for India, but for the globe. The other aspect that we've looked at is the PACT initiative, that is our Partnership for Accelerated Clinical Trials, where we are looking at building capacities within our neighboring countries around the region to make them in a position where they're ready to take up these clinical trials. And we've done training programs for more than 10 countries. And we've had more than about 700 of the clinical researchers, healthcare workers going through this training to be able to take up clinical trials as we move forward. So I think to summarize, what we've been able to do is to look at this capacity that we've built today for COVID, learning a lot from our experience that we had earlier, but also positioning India that moving ahead is going to be beyond COVID as well. We hope that we will not have another pandemic, but I think the learnings from this pandemic are clearly that we have these centers for platform technologies. We look at now the next step is to look at pan-COVID or pan-corona vaccines, to look at platform technologies which can help us to overcome these challenges. And most importantly, focusing on molecular surveillance, which gets connected with epidemiological surveillance so that we could very quickly detect these, the forthcoming pandemics and see how we could respond to that. So I'd like to conclude by saying that today we are so confident that this excellent S&T collaboration, and how did this happen? This happened through collaboration. This happened through collective ownership. And this also happened through the teams coming together with sharing of knowledge. And I think this is something which is definitely going to take us forward as we move ahead. So I like to conclude by saying thank you very much. This has been excellent, and we look forward to India playing a very important role as we move ahead in this fight, not just against this pandemic, but also in positioning India to be as one of the global biomanufacturing, R&D, innovation hubs for the pharma sector moving ahead. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Swarup. So, one question that comes to mind is, we already make 60% of the world's vaccines, and we can only get better. So looking back, we've obviously achieved tremendous gains and successes, but the virus itself is perhaps posing to be a bigger challenger than we thought it would, and more so right now because cases are spiraling all over again. What would you perhaps do differently, if at all, if you were to look at what we've gone through in the last year, and if you were to look ahead?
So looking ahead, I think one is, as I said, this virus sort of took us by surprise. Obviously, pandemics do that. But I think one thing is for sure, that what we would do differently is that our preparedness for such pandemics, we need to work on it today. And what I spoke to you about, and that's why I kept reiterating that point, is this is a preparedness not just to handle COVID or the coronavirus or COVID-2. There could be other COVIDs as they come in. I think this is a preparedness now to handle any such infections that come in. We also need to look at the zoonotics and many other such infections that may come in. I mean, it could be a COVID virus, it could be an AMR, it could be any other such pandemic. I think our preparedness to handle such challenges is what we need to take ahead. And I think that's really where we would now like to move forward.
Right, and you talked about the work that we're doing across the board, whether it's in therapeutics, vaccines. Now, if you were to look at the chain, I mean, so we have there is distribution, there is production. Now, private sector is actively involved in the production, but on distribution, if I were to use that word for either for vaccines or testing, private sector has a relatively limited role. So do you see these that equation changing as we go ahead in order to maybe achieve greater reach?
So as you rightly said, private sector has been a very important stakeholder, and as we move forward in the development aspects of it, the healthcare interventions as well, the private sector has been engaged, whether it's been our Ayushman Bharat and other such activities. And now when you see, even in the vaccination program, the private sector has come in, the testing. So anything that you need to take on to scale and reach it out, the involvement of the private sector is very important. So whether it's the testing or whether it's the vaccination, the engagement with the private sector is very important and critical. And we've seen that. We've seen that in the testing, and we're seeing that now in the vaccination as well.
Right, and before I bring in Hari, you have a unique ringside view of engaging with and working with some very, very young and innovative people in the startup ecosystem. Any examples that come to mind of either people that you've met that give you the hope that we are equipped not just as manufacturers but also as innovators and young innovators?
So the diagnostic story that I shared with you, I think 80% of those who brought in the diagnostic kits into the country today are our young startups. Our young startups who came up with their sort of first products into manufacturing, ventilators. You saw many young startups, engineering students who came in with novel designs, because we were looking at something that caters to our market here, that caters to our needs. And what was critical for us was the affordability aspect. So I think that was important. We had nearly 200 startups who came up with excellent innovative solutions, which are today in the market, from sanitizers to ventilators to masks. I mean, it was a mass campaign for masks. We didn't have masks in the country. And how did we so quickly get this? It was these innovations which came in from our young startups. So I think, again, it's important to remember this, that how did we respond so quickly? It's because we had already, over these last few years, built a very strong foundation. The Startup Action Plan, which was announced in 2016 when the Honorable Prime Minister announced it, had set the foundation for it. And that's how BIRAC today has nearly over 4,000 startups and about 500 or 600 small companies. We could just sort of ignite this, this very large cohort that we had, and they responded. I think that's really the strength that we've seen, and we've seen them excited. We've seen them delivering in the shortest period of time and actually standing up to the challenge that we posed to them.
Right, and the question that I would have for you is that what more can you do for them? But let me pause that for a second and let me come to Hari. Hari, tell us about what the foundation is doing in the area of particularly in the context of manufacturing and building the capacity for manufacturing. So would it be investing in R&D? Would it be bringing in more R&D ideas, creating more global partnerships?
Well, so thanks, Govind, for the opportunity, and pleasure, Dr. Swaroop, to be on the panel with you. I think the simple answer is, Govind, all of the above, because what we're trying to do is figure out the white spaces that we can occupy to play a catalytic role. I mean, in India, and I'll focus my response on what we are trying to do in the context of India, the government is obviously driving the large scale response, be it, in terms of the pandemic control measures or scaling up the availability of vaccines. So what we've tried to do through the past year is really look at some of the key partners that we have, and DBT is actually our oldest partnership in India in that sense. So what we've tried to do is engage with the government to understand where they see a role for us to contribute and provide flexible funding in some cases partner on the development of novel vaccine candidates, and the other, we work with Gavi and COVAX to also look at ways to make sure that access of vaccines that are produced in India gets to people that need them the most in India and other countries. So we have been working on all of those fronts, and I'd say the results, as the Foreign Secretary, laid out quite clearly and articulately in his speech, are pretty impressive. India has actually sent out over 60 million vaccines through the Vaccine Maitri initiative and through COVAX at a time when our national coverage is just about the same. So I don't think there's any other country that comes close in terms of balancing the global need with domestic needs. And there are several other vaccine candidates in the pipeline that DBT is supporting. So there are some phase 3 candidates who will hopefully get approval in subsequent months. So we can expect India's manufacturing capacity to further ramp up, not just the two existing vaccine manufacturers, Serum and Bharat, but additional people coming online. So we will continue to look for opportunities to play a contributing role. Last May, actually, Mr. Gates had a conversation with the Honorable Prime Minister, where the Honorable Prime Minister laid out his vision of, India stepping up to provide the needs of vaccines that the world will require and encouraging us to contribute. So we've really been engaged since then. And I say, our contribution and our partnership is going to continue through the rest of this year, because as you said, the virus ain't done with us. So we really need to keep pace with, where the next phase goes.
Right. And we're running out of time for this. But very quickly, Hari, and then I'll come back to Dr. Swarup. What's the one interesting thing that you've seen and found exciting in the startup ecosystem? And let me focus on that, since that always leaves us with a sense of positive spirit at the end of everything.
Yeah, no, I think just how future ready we are, right? A year ago, when this pandemic was starting to break loose, we had all sorts of dire projections about, how states will struggle to respond, how we don't have capacity, how we don't have, testing equipment, reagents. Just look at how much has changed. I mean, and it didn't even take 6 months for that narrative to change. And it's really, as Dr. Swarup said, because of domestic innovators. So I'm incredibly bullish about, where India is poised to go from here. And I totally agree with Dr. Swarup that this is about, preparing for the future, and also looking at how the lessons we've learned from COVID can be applied to diseases like TB, right? There's no reason why a lot of these elements cannot be translated over to TB, and why we can't actually live up to that elimination goal that India has by 2025. So I feel this partnership between government, India startup ecosystem, partners like us can actually play a huge role in accelerating health outcomes here as well as globally.
Right, right. Thanks for that, Hari. Dr. Swarup, let me come back to you. So the one thing that you would want to do, perhaps in response to what people are asking you to do, for the broader manufacturing ecosystem, and the one thing that you would want to do and have not done already for the startup ecosystem.
So I think, let me talk about the startup ecosystem first, because that will lead into the manufacturing one as
Sure.
well. The startup ecosystem, I will not say we've not done it, but we've moved in that direction. But I think we need to now scale that much more. Is we have been looking at the scalability of the startup innovation ecosystem. I think what we are now working towards is focusing on the sustainability of that ecosystem. And for that, what I mean is we started by, sort of creating a very, very robust pipeline by bringing them into this whole startup ecosystem. But we need to bring in more investors who can then look at sustaining these enterprises as they move forward. I mean, the government currently the government is now really facilitating it. We've also gone ahead and set up early venture funds. We've set up these fund of funds to, so there's a lot of risk mitigation that we've done. It's helped because you see a lot of private funds, VC funds, the early stage, Series A, B, all of them coming forward and having more confidence in the life sciences and biotech sector, which is a risky sector as it's called. So that has started, but I think we need to focus on that if we have to get them, because we have some extremely wonderful ideas which they have converted into enterprises. They're risky. You're talking about something like artificial organs. You're talking about new drug development. How can a startup go right through unless and until you give them the? So that's something we need to focus on. And that takes me to the manufacturing part of it. So for COVID vaccine, of course, we're trying to see how we could help the current manufacturers ramp up their manufacturing capacities. One is, of course, the large number of vaccines that will come in. The other is even looking at other existing capacities which are there if they need some facilitation to be able to be ramped up. But more importantly, I think we need to bring in more players into this. And that's really where some of these startups, some of these small companies, I won't even say they've matured from startups to small companies, need to be positioned there. So we are starting what we call technology clusters, where we allow them to do their prototype testing and go in for small scale manufacturing, clinical lot manufacturing, where we do their risk mitigation by allowing them to test out their clinical lots, developmental lots, so that they are ready for commercial manufacturing. I think those technology clusters, as they come up, linked to the biotech parks, linked to these zones that we have created, is probably something which will, as we move on, see the next phase of our preparedness for bringing out these therapeutic vaccines on scale.
Right. So absolutely. Last question. So in the last 1 year, I mean, I know you're happy where you are. You're performing an important role, but you miss being in a laboratory and leading a research effort.
For that, I would have to go back 30 years, because that's when I left the laboratory and came into this field of science management. But let me tell you, I've not regretted it a single day, because the vast experience you get and the broad spectrum of activities that you have to get into managing science, which I feel is as important as doing the science itself. Because managing science, facilitating science, creating a robust ecosystem is very important. And you truly need scientists to be here to understand the needs of this ecosystem. So I haven't regretted being in this position of a science manager since I joined it way back in '89.
Okay, great. Dr. Swarup, thank you so much. And I'm sure the scientists are also equally happy having you here as opposed to anyone else. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Thank you for providing a vision for what your department and indeed the government of India will play in fostering the manufacturing and the startup ecosystem, particularly in creating capacity for the future. Thank you, Hari, as well, for joining us. And let me now invite David Gold, CEO of Global Health Strategies. David is the co-founder and CEO of the Global Health Strategies, or GHS as it's popularly known. He's an attorney by training, but began his career in advocacy, working as an AIDS treatment activist with ACT UP and as a medical information director at Gay Men's Health Crisis, the first in the World AIDS non-profit organization. Prior to founding GHS in 2002, he co-founded AVAC to push for greater global investment in AIDS vaccine development and HIV prevention, and also served as the founding vice president for policy and public support at the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative. David, it's over to you.
Thank you, Govind. I want to thank this panel. It was a terrific panel for Govind, for Dr. Swarup, and my friend Hari Menon. This was a terrific discussion on the most critical issue that the world is facing today. I also want to thank Taran Das, Kira and Pasrika, and the team at the Ananda Center, our partners, in really helping us get this word out. And lastly, I want to thank Mr. Harsh Vardhan Shringla. The fact that the Foreign Secretary would take time out of his busy schedule at a moment in history like this to share his vision and what the Indian government, how they see the world today in COVID-19, means so much to us. finally, I want to thank the GHS team that has worked so hard in doing the research on this, talking with people all over the country, and documenting the history of your country's extraordinary investment in innovation and biotechnology and medicines and vaccines and drugs and diagnostics. The impact that has had, not only, of course, in India, but in the world, has been incredible. As Govind mentioned, I started my career in HIV/AIDS, and I saw firsthand that when Indian companies stepped in and said, we can produce these HIV drugs at a far lesser cost, quality medicines, it changed the world. And 37 million people around the world are getting HIV medications because of that step. We are now at an extraordinary moment in history where we are all being tested as individuals, as organizations and agencies, as leaders, and as countries. From New York City, almost 12,000 kilometers away, I can tell you what your country is doing across so many aspects of this pandemic, and investing it is extraordinary. And when we first started talking about this report, the reason we did is because we wanted to help tell the story of what's happening, what your government is doing, what your innovators are doing, not only for India, but to hopefully encourage other countries to make investments in innovation and being able to develop and produce drugs, vaccines, diagnostics that can save people's lives and help all of us live healthy, more productive lives. So with that, I salute you all. I thank you for the extraordinary time that you've given us and the insights and wisdom you have shared. Hopefully this is the beginning of telling the story of what happens when a country and all its stakeholders invest in innovation and what it can do, not only for that country, for the world. So good evening to all of you, and we look forward to working with you to tell the story again.
Thank you very much. Good evening and good night.